Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Donna Johnson. I'm a board member with the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association. Tonight we're delighted to bring you a presentation by Sue Hageland entitled Making Sense of Irregular Words. Many of you attended Gina Cook's webinar on sight words earlier this year and asked for more on the topics she discussed. Tonight's webinar is our response to your request. Before I introduce Sue, let's take care of some logistics. We have a large number of people attending tonight's webinar, and we have muted everyone's microphone to make it easier to hear. However, you may type questions at any time using the control panel window you see on your computer. We'll collect these for Sue, and she'll answer as many of them as possible during our time together tonight. We also want you to know that we're recording this webinar, and it will be available to view on our website in a few days. We'll send an email with a link to everyone who registered for tonight's event. IDA UMB is able to provide our webinars free of charge because of the generosity of both our speakers and our membership. If you already are a member of IDA, thank you for your support. If you are not, please consider joining us as a member. You will be supporting our efforts to spread awareness of dyslexia and to provide research-based information on effective reading instruction for all students. You'll find information on membership at our website, and we'll send you a link in our follow-up email. This is our final webinar of this school year. We have exciting new topics coming when live webinars resume in the fall. In the meantime, please take some time this summer to view our previously recorded webinars on the IDA UMB website. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Sue Hageland is an Orton Gillingham trained tutor who has studied the structure of the writing system through orthographic linguistics. She has done teacher training and presented on this topic at special education conferences. Sue serves as a board member for the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association. She became interested in dyslexia and effective reading instruction more than 12 years ago as the parent of a child with dyslexia, and she is passionate about helping parents and teachers develop knowledge and understanding about these topics so that all children can become skilled readers, writers, and learners. Welcome, Sue, and thank you for speaking with all of us tonight.
Thank you, Donna. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with all of you about this topic. As Donna mentioned, we asked Gina Cook to do a webinar for our branch last year, and I was particularly eager to have her talk with all of you about it because for several years I've been studying with Gina as well as with Pete Bowers and with the author of the Real Spelling Resources that you'll hear more about later. And the things that I have learned through that study about how the writing system actually works from a linguistic perspective have been unbelievably powerful for enhancing my own understanding about how English works and what it is that we need to be doing to help struggling students. So we're going to talk tonight about specific words and specific examples, and I'll share my own understanding of these words as that stands today, my own understanding as it exists today. But I'm not going to talk all that much about specific approaches to teaching. We can teach in a lot of different ways, through investigation, through direct systematic instruction. There are many ways to teach. And we know that for dyslexic students, the approaches we use are particularly critical. But although we often talk about how to teach, we don't talk very much about what to teach. These examples that we're going to talk about tonight of words that we call irregular actually allow us to look at evidence about how the writing system itself works and to think about what it is that we teach students about the system and about whether shifting our own understanding might help all of us work with students more effectively, and particularly our dyslexic students. So we're going to jump right in and look at some specific words that are generally classified as irregular and see if we can make some sense of them. So I picked words for this list that seem to show up on almost every irregular word list that I could find. Many of these give students lots of trouble, particularly dyslexic students, because most spelling instruction assumes that all of these words have at least a few letters that just can't be explained. They just don't, the spellings don't make sense. And therefore, we teach these spellings almost as random strings of letters at times. So we're going to look at all these words, but we're not going to look at them one at a time. We will talk about them in relationship to other words, and sometimes by looking at several of these supposedly irregular words together. And in fact, this is the first concept that I want you to consider tonight. The idea that we need to study words by looking at their relationship to other words. And that when we study words in isolation, we are actually not really seeing the writing system as it actually works. Because one of the things that the English writing system does is that it shows us connections in meaning through structural connections. And we actually cannot see that when we look at words in isolation. And I just added this slide this afternoon because I came across it, and this is interesting to me because it's true that the writing system shows us meaning and structure relationships, no matter who we are. But this idea of structure and relationships is particularly relevant for dyslexic students. This is a screenshot that I took about a week ago when I was working with one of my students who is dyslexic. And I was showing him this list of words that we're going to cover. This was my working list before I realized I could never get through all of these words in 1 hour. So some of these we aren't going to cover tonight, but this was my list, and I showed it to him, and I started to ask him about some of these words. And before I could even say anything, he started drawing these circles. So I just watched what he did, and then I asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, these words just look like they go together. So this to me was such a wonderful illustration of the fact that we are pattern seeking when we look at the writing system. We are looking for meaning. We are looking for patterns. And dyslexic students in particular really respond to finding the real meaningful patterns that exist in the writing system. And we can make a huge difference in working with them by recognizing that and incorporating that into the work we do with them. So let's take a look at these 3 words, first of all, says, been, and does. And as we do that, I'm going to ask you to consider 2 questions. First, if the educational world as a whole considers these words to be irregular, then what is it about them that inspires people to say that they're irregular, to put them in a little box and say, well, these words don't make sense. They have to be memorized. And I'm going to present some evidence these words actually do make sense. So if that's true, and there is regularity and sense in the spelling of these words, then why don't we talk about that? Why don't we see that? Why is there such agreement in the educational world that these words are rule breakers? And then secondly, if we consider the idea that perhaps these words actually do make sense, then what is really driving their spelling? And if there is regularity here, then does that type of regularity exist in the rest of the writing system? So first, let's look at this word says. This is spelled S-A-Y-S, and just about everyone calls this an irregular spelling. And why is that? Well, let's start by talking about what type of a word this is and what it means. This word says is a verb. It's the second person form of a verb, so we would say she says. And the first person form of that verb is this one, S-A-Y. And it's spelled like this. We pronounce it say. And of course, that may seem very basic as I explain this to you, but I want you to think think about the fact that we don't call this verb an irregular spelling. It's considered decodable, predictable, and we teach it to kids as making sense. Here are 2 other verbs, drive and play, D-R-I-V-E, P-L-I-Y, and these are not irregular either. All of these are straightforward spellings that are classified as fitting the rules of English. So then to go from this first person form of the verb to the second person form, we simply add a suffix S. So I drive, she drives. I play, he plays. I say, she says. So when we look at these words in this way, do you see anything about the spelling of these words, the spelling of S-A-Y-S, that is in any way irregular? Now, there's a really simple common pattern here. It's applied in exactly the same way in all 3 of these words. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, that's pretty obvious. But this is actually a really critical question. Why do we classify the first 2 verbs as regular spellings and the third as an irregular spelling? And it's pretty obvious that it's actually not the spelling, it's the pronunciation. The pronunciation of says is not says, as we would expect when we compare it, say, to plays. But if we have an unexpected pronunciation, does that mean that we have an irregular spelling? So hold that thought and let's look at the next word. So here's the word been, as in it's been raining all afternoon, and it's spelled B-E-E-N. This is also a verb. It's the past participle of the verb be, which you see at the bottom of this list. And all of these verbs could be substituted in this phrase. I will blank. I will take, I will rise, I will fall, I will eat, I will drive, I will be. So then how do we form the past participle for these verbs? B-E-E-N is a past participle, and here's the past participle forms. I have taken, I have risen, I have fallen, I have eaten, I have driven, I have been. In English, there are several ways to form the past participle, but notice that all of these verbs follow the same pattern in forming the past participle. We add a suffix en. And if there is a silent e, a final non-syllabic e, as we see in the base elements take, rise, and drive, then when we add the vowel suffix en, we drop the final e in the base and we add the suffix. That's what the slash mark represents in those word sums, the application of the e rule for suffixing that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But notice that we do not drop the final e in the construction be plus en. And the reason for that is the e in be is not silent. It's pronounced. It's representing the vowel phoneme in that base element, be. So there's no silent e there. Therefore, we don't drop it, and we simply add the suffix en, and we get be plus en. So again, as you look at the structure of these words, as you see the regularity in these spellings, it's clear here that the problem is not that we have an irregular spelling, we have an unexpected pronunciation. And we do see pronunciation shifts in some of these other past participles, drive, driven, rise, risen, but we don't seem to have trouble with those because of the way we think about those words and those pronunciations. But my question to you at this point is, do you see structure here that makes sense? Could it make sense to students, do you think, who are trying to understand these words? And if it makes sense, then look at some of these common misspellings that might occur for this word and ask yourself, do these spellings make more sense than B-E-E-N when you look at all these words together and the pattern that we see here? So the fundamental question I want you to start thinking about is, what kind of a difference does it make to your understanding of these words and their spelling when we look at structure first and then talk about pronunciation rather than the other way around? Here's another set of words. Earlier, I mentioned that Gina Cook's webinar for IDEA-UMB was a very popular one, and another one that has been hugely popular was Pete Bauer's talk that he gave for us last year. And I hope if you haven't seen that, take a look at it soon. In his webinar, Pete talks about the words go, G-O, and do, D-O, and their derivatives. And here we see the derivatives. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I want to ask you to think about one idea. And that is that when we look at these very short, very common words like goes and done, we often miss the fact that these words are complex. Being complex means that these words consist of not just a single base element, a single word that is not dividable, but a base element plus an affix of some sort. In this case, in all of these cases actually, it's a suffix. So we have a base element plus a suffix. And seeing the two morphemes in these words, the base and the suffix are both morphemes in these written words. Seeing those morphemes is the key to understanding their meaning and the spelling of these words. The structure of the words is the foundation of understanding them. But it's very easy to dismiss that as not really mattering all that much when our students often get so much exposure to these words that they manage to spell them correctly eventually, even if they don't really understand them. But when we get further along in literacy instruction, it becomes really critical for our students to have morphological awareness and to see and understand the complex structure of words. And we have a chance to start developing that morphological awareness right from the very beginning by showing students that morphemes are key to these words, that this is how the writing system actually works, and that the writing system has logic and reason in every aspect of every word. So we've just looked very briefly at a few words that are called irregular, and I want to step back for just a second and clarify specifically why they are called that, why they are classified that way, why we call them irregular. From what you've seen so far, would you agree that there's evidence that these words are irregular not because of their spelling? It's not actually the spelling that's irregular, They make sense morphologically, they make sense structurally. They are called irregular because of a perceived disconnect between their pronunciation and their spelling. And calling these words irregularly spelled because of their pronunciation actually reflects an assumption about how the writing system is supposed to work that's very deeply embedded in every aspect of our educational system. There is an assumption that words are spelled the way they are for a particular reason. And when a big group of words doesn't fit that assumption, and in her talk earlier, Gina Cook did some math to show us how many words that would be that don't actually fit this assumption, and it's a lot of words. So instead of saying, I wonder if we need to look at this assumption a little bit more deeply, we just sort of set those words off to the side and call them irregular and just go on without really questioning that assumption. But we want to look at that tonight. We want to consider that assumption that is never questioned and think about the rule that these actually very logically spelled words are supposedly breaking. So this is the assumption that most of the educational world holds, and that is that the purpose of the spelling system is to represent pronunciation directly. This is everywhere in our instruction. Students are taught to spell, generally, by going directly from speech to text. But we have a lot of evidence that this is not an adequate explanation for how the writing system works. With this assumption, there are so many exceptions that we really should stop and think about another way to look at things. We really need to think about morphology and etymology and their role in spelling, among other things. Now, I'm going to add that structured literacy programs do teach morphology, but it comes late. We almost always start with phoneme-grapheme relationships, including frequency of grapheme usage, at the very beginning. And students are often years into their literacy instruction before they learn about morphology. And this sequence of instruction is based on this assumption about the purpose of the spelling system. And I want to stop for just a second before we go any further and define a couple of terms, because I know I'm already starting to talk about morphemes and graphemes and phonemes. So let's talk about what a grapheme is. A grapheme is a letter or a combination of letters that represents a phoneme. And a phoneme is a meaningful unit of pronunciation in English. So in this diagram, you can see that the grapheme C, that those angle brackets represent the fact that that's a letter or a digraph, or it's some sort of a grapheme. It's either 1, 2, or 3 letters inside of those angle brackets, and that's a grapheme. And that C can represent k, s, or sh in the English writing system. We can also, using a diagram like this, show some constraints on when this particular grapheme will represent these phonemes that you can see here. And here's another grapheme to phoneme chart. The grapheme EA here, it's a digraph, 2 letters that form one grapheme and represent one phoneme. They can represent the phoneme E, or in 3 very common words, A. So graphemes can be single letters, digraphs, which are 2 letters, or trigraphs, which are 3 letters, and phonemes are the parts of pronunciation that are distinctive for me. In the words cat and sat, the k and s at the beginning are phonemes, and changing those phonemes changes the meaning of the word, so that's what we mean by distinctive phoneming. And phonemes are represented in written language by graphemes. So that's a very quick, simple overview of those 2 terms, but I'm going to use them as we talk, and I wanted to just quickly define them. And I will also add that systematic approaches to language study look at these relationships between graphemes and phonemes in great detail and really focus on helping students to learn them. And the concepts that we're going to talk about today actually allow that kind of study to be even more accurate and deep and systematic and meaningful. And we can look at that if you're interested when we get to the question part of things. So let's go back to this assumption about the writing system, which is an educational assumption. It's not something you will find in linguistics. Linguistics is the science that studies language, and orthographic linguistics is the branch of linguistics that studies spelling. If you read the work of orthographic linguists, I did not mean to put so many tongue twisters in this particular part of my conversation tonight, but if you read the work of orthographic linguists, they are clear that going directly from speech to text does not work. Not because the system contains all of these exceptions, but because that's not how the English writing system actually works. When it's looked at from a scientific perspective, we see something very different. The first idea that's really important is that English is a morpho-phonemic language. So this is a quote from Richard Vinesky, who is a linguist who's very respected in the educational world. And his comment here is that the simple fact is that the present orthography is not merely a letter-to-sound system riddled with imperfections, but instead a more complex and more regular relationship wherein phoneme and morpheme share leading roles. So this is a linguist speaking about spelling. Now, I do have to add that there's one person from IDA who has been talking about the importance of morphology for many, many years, and that is Marcia Henry, who we at IDA UMB are very happy to call our own. She was one of the founders of the Upper Midwest branch of the IDA, and her work on morphology has really had a huge impact on IDA. But most of the educational world has not been integrating morphology deeply enough and early enough into what we do. We're not teaching kids how the writing system really works when we ignore this. And even within IDA, we're not integrating this early enough and showing students that the spelling system is built on morphology, not just phonology. So here's another way to look at the linguistic perspective on the writing system. This is a concept diagram from the author of a resource called Real Spelling. This was also created by someone who is a linguist. And this concept diagram shows that to understand the spelling system, we start with meaning, but then we need to look at structure, as we just did in looking at the spelling of the words says and been and does. We need to consider etymology, which includes the history of words and also their relationship to other related words in present-day English. And only then can we look at and really understand the phonology, the relationship between phonemes and graphemes. Now, I want to make sure that I'm really clear that I'm not saying there is no connection between pronunciation and spelling. You see that in language all the time. And phonology is right here on this concept diagram, representing the pronunciation of meaning. I mean, we know that we don't spell the word says with a Q, two R's, and a U. It's letters, graphemes that make sense. But the relationship is not a one-to-one code. Spelling is not a direct translation of speech. It is much more complex and much more rich and meaningful than that. So we want to look at all of these things before we start considering phonology. And we've talked a little bit about morphology with says, been, does, goes. Let's look at etymology. So I'm going to tell you a story about one of my students. I'm working with this incredibly bright little third grader who's getting a lot of direction in school on this whole approach of spelling by starting with pronunciation and then trying to spell from what he's sounding it out. And he's really frustrated. And he's a little bit of a problem solver and a creative thinker. So he announced to me one day that he has a proposal for a better way to spell. And he said, I think that we should spell long vowels with a capital letter. So we know how to pronounce them and we know how to spell them. So the word here would be spelled like this. And he was very interested in talking with me about this. And I think it's a very interesting idea. So my next question to him, though, of course, was, which here do you mean? Is it the one on the left or is it the one on the right? And we talked about that, and he said, well, it was the one on the left. And so then, okay, well, how would we spell the one on the right? Should we spell it the same way, H capital E-R? He said, no, I think we should spell it the way it already is spelled. And the reason was, he said, well, we wouldn't know which one we were talking about if we spelled them both the same, and we wouldn't know what it meant. And so this student, even though he could see the frustration in the system, he understood that there's a principle in the writing system that he did not want to give up with his new, better way to spell. It is a principle of English spelling that when two or more words in English are pronounced the same but mean different things, whenever possible, they will be spelled differently. This, again, is from Vinesky. And Pete Bowers, who I mentioned earlier, loves to use this expression that we think about homophones as a bug in the system because it creates confusion, but it is actually a feature. When we look at English spelling, homophones, words that sound the same but mean different things, are all over the place. They often have different origins, and we really have to have a way to deal with them in our writing system. We are used to thinking about base elements that are homophones, like these that you're seeing right now. But when we add suffixes and the fact that English is morphological, we get even more homophones. And if we add phrases, even more than that. So think about taking the first words, the words in the first column, and just saying, well, we're gonna spell everything to the right the way it's spelled on the left. What would that do to your ability to understand as you read silently, which is one of the main purposes of the writing systems, to allow us to extract meaning quickly and efficiently as we read silently. Our orthography has evolved to allow us to distinguish these homophones quickly and accurately. When we are reading silently, we rely on these homophones, but is there any structure or logic to the spelling of homophones? We've seen that in homophones that carry suffixes, on that last slide, that sometimes the suffix allows us to understand distinctions in meaning. But do graphemes have any relationship? Well, they actually do. The choice of grapheme in certain homophones often helps us to see meaningful connections, and in a very positive way, it allows us to show those connections and help make those spellings make more sense to our students. So if we look at the spelling of this word, P-R-E-Y, we often encounter this word as a word that's kind of challenging for kids to remember and understand. It's pronounced pray, but it's spelled with an E-Y, and so we don't consider this the default spelling for this pronunciation. This would be the default spelling. But notice that this is already a word that has meaning, and we don't want to confuse ourselves by spelling these words both the same way, so we need an alternative. But why is it the EY? Well, there are a number of words, a small number of words, that use EY to spell A. And in every single case, there is a good reason that that EY is in that spelling. It helps us to see and understand the meaning of those words. The EY in pray, P-R-E-Y, shows us a relationship to this word, predator, which is also spelled with an E. We have a grapheme EY in P-R-E-Y, and we have a grapheme E in predator, but both of them have that letter in common. Obey, O-B-E-Y, has a connection meaning to obedient. Again, the same sort of relationship. If you look at these words this way, does this possible misspelling or alternative spelling of obey make any sense? Does this help you see the meaningful unit in that word if we were to spell it the default way, if we think about pronunciation first? So again, does starting with the written form and looking at words in relationship to one another make a difference for you in your understanding of the spelling of these words? And do you think it would make a difference for students, particularly students who have a tough time with phonology and are looking for meaningful ways to make sense of the words they're trying to learn? Let's take a quick look at said, S-A-I-D. We're going to start with its meaning. So it's a verb. It's related to these words, say and says. We've already seen a relationship between the spelling of these first two words. And notice that said, S-A-I-D, shows a connection in spelling and meaning with these words on this list. Said, S-A-I-D, is not a complex word in present-day English. In other words, it's a base. It doesn't have a suffix that we can remove. It uses AI as the grapheme, because we typically use AI in the middle of a base element, while say, S-A-Y, and says, S-A-Y-S, use AY because we use that at the end of a base element, and in S-A-Y-S we've got a base plus a suffix. So there's logic there, that all makes sense. And in fact, we have several other verbs that use exactly the same pattern, which we never have any trouble with. So lay, lays, laid, pay, pays, paid, say, says, said. Again, the issue is not the spelling. Look at how regular that spelling is. The issue is the pronunciation. But do you think looking at these words in this way would help students to avoid errors like this, which are a logical result of teaching kids to start with pronunciation when we spell words and to learn words that don't fit those rules as though they are random strings of letters? All right, here's another example of structure and meaning relationships. So this word T-H-E-R-E is considered irregular if we assume that the primary purpose of the spelling system is to represent pronunciation. But we don't have a problem with this word, H-E-R-E. This is here, and this is and I'm going to use this word to talk about another very interesting idea about understanding this group of misunderstood words that we're talking about. Because in a sense, these aren't so much irregular words as you're seeing as misunderstood. We can often use a word that has an expected pronunciation to help us with words that don't, by connecting the meaning and structure of these words together and then anchoring the pronunciation to a word that everyone considers regular. So here is not a confusing word, H-E-R-E, in spelling or pronunciation. And look at its structure. You can see the graphemes that are used and the spelling pattern we see. And now look at these two. So what sort of meaning connection do these three words have? And obviously they all have to do with location. Where is everyone? Well, we're sitting here and everyone else is over there. And there is a structural connection. The graphemes and the spelling pattern that we see here is very similar. And my student at the beginning was seeing those relationships, those patterns, when he was circling those words. Here is a homophone of the word that is spelled T-H-E-R-E, and this one is spelled T-H-E-I-R. And it's a word that is often confused. But again, let's look at words that are related in meaning and structure and see if this makes sense. So here are two more words, T-H-E-M, nobody considers this irregular, them. T-H-E-Y, another irregular word, they. And do they have a meaning connection? Well, they're all third person plural pronouns. And the first one is possessive. The second one is the object form. The third is the subject form. So they gave us cookies. We gave them cookies. Their cookies are the best. All of those forms use a grapheme that contains the letter E. And again, the spelling T-H-E-M is expected. Everyone would think that's regular. So we can anchor any discussions of the spelling to that word if that's helpful. It may not even be necessary, but if it's a helpful transition in thinking about pronunciation and meaning and spelling, that can be used. With say and said, we had this AI and AY grapheme pattern, and we see the same thing here. We have an EY at the end of the spelling they. We have an EI in the middle of the spelling there. They all have an E. The more that you look at these, the more you begin to see structural relationships. And what's really exciting about this is that this way of looking at words and teaching it to students is very generative for the students. The kids begin to understand that the way to make sense of words is to look at how they're built, think about what they mean, and find relationships between words. And they start to see this on their own. I have some older students who I've been working with, and when I started working with them, they already knew a lot of these common words. They just memorized them. So we don't necessarily talk about all of them, but we always talk about this aspect of understanding structure and meaning before pronunciation. It's everywhere in our writing system, actually. So they know that this is something that they can use as they work with words. And I had one of my students come in this week, and I'm not making this up. This literally was 2 days ago. And my student said to me, hey, I think I figured out why T-H-E-I-R is spelled the way it is. And I'm honestly telling you, I had not been looking at those words with her. But her spelling list last week in 5th grade had some of these easily confused words on them, and this is one of them. She said, I always used to mix up the E and the I, but now I think about it now as they, T-H-E-Y plus an R, because I know those words are related. And I know we have to use that E-I in the middle. She literally used, she literally said, I was thinking about how it's built. And I just about hugged her. Now, she had some other questions. And she was asking me what was the R suffix. She was still trying to sort that out. But she actually took the spelling test and spelled it right, because she had a way to independently make sense of a spelling that had never made sense to her before. She did that on her own by thinking about structure, by thinking about relationships and meaning, and by beginning to understand how the spelling system really works. And here's just a couple more. Again, we're seeing homophone, H-E-A-R, which can easily be confused with H-E-R-E. But when you look at the relationship between H-E-A-R and H-E-A-R-D and think about that meaning and structure connection, then it is obvious that the spelling of heard, I heard something on the radio, has to be H-E-A-R-D and not H-E-R-D, which again is another word. So by seeing these structural connections, we can clarify homophone confusion. And look at how many supposedly irregular words are on this page. I have a colleague named Aviva, and one of the quotes that one of the things she said that gets often quoted with a lot of the people that I work with is that by studying words this way, starting with the written form, we buy one word and get lots more free. So in a sense, we can study these words. We're looking not only at spelling, we're looking at grammar, we're kind of understanding how these words fit into the writing system, and we can make sense of these irregular words and easily confused words, but we do that by starting with the written form. All right, one more thing, and then I'm going to stop and take a few questions in case there's anything that people are really wondering about right now. So this is just a fascinating example of structuring meaning relationships that I had never noticed. And it's one of many things that Gina Cook has mentioned to me in passing that have kind of blown me away. So I was at a workshop with her recently, and she commented, and I'm not sure I'm quoting her completely accurately, so this is my interpretation of what I took away. My understanding was that she was saying there was a historical connection between TH and WH in a number of words where WH was the question word, and we know that WH is often a question word, and TH was in a sense the answer. So when, then, where, there, whence, thence. And I thought this was amazing, and I was jotting down these words, and I decided I wanted to go look up whence and thence, because certainly that's not in my everyday conversation. So I went to the dictionary on my Mac, and here's what I found. This was the beginning of the entries. So whence, adverb, from what place or source. Thence, adverb, from a place or source previously mentioned. And I mean, you couldn't ask for a more amazing illustration of the relationship of structure and meaning in terms of simply the spelling of these words. This was just kind of a huge wow moment for me. And that's really interesting, obviously, but then what's really cool is now we can take that back and look at a word whose pronunciation seems odd and see a structural relationship. So then we have what? That. W-H-A-T, T-H-A-T. Now, there are actually a number of other aspects of the grapheme-phoneme relationship in the spelling W-H-A-T that are really interesting and really productive, and they explain tons of other words. But just looking at this alone, doesn't that bring sense to that spelling in a way that we would never see if we were looking at the word in isolation? It is seeing the relationships that helps us understand meaning. So now I built in a little break here to give myself a chance to take a, and Donna a chance to ask any questions that might have come up that are not clear. But I will ask you if you have major questions. We'll kind of hold those for the end.
Okay, there are questions. The first one, actually, a number of people are wondering if they will receive copies of these slides because they really want them. Okay.
Yes, I will send copies.
When the webinar is online, is on our website, these will be with them.
Yes, we'll send out a link to the recording and a link to the handouts. I don't like to give them out ahead of time because I'm building a lot of these ideas, and so it's kind of is distracting if you aren't able to just follow along, but you will definitely have a copy of them, and you can always watch the recording again if you want to capture certain ideas and connect those to the handout.
Okay, I'm just going to read one thing to encourage you. No question, this is one of the best presentations about this I've ever seen. I love that we're teaching them to look for patterns, which we all say students with dyslexia are exceptionally good at. Go, Sue.
Well, that's great. Okay.
There's a couple like that. There's a real basic question. I don't know if you want to keep it to the end. I think it's about emerging readers, especially ones that are having trouble. For instance, what came to my mind is, what is the youngest age at which you would share this presentation with students or something based on it?
Well, I wouldn't share this presentation necessarily, but I would definitely talk to students at the earliest ages about morphology, about base elements, suffixes, prefixes. I had a first grade student who came in with a misspelling for the word added, A-D-I-D. So that's a student who has no difficulty with phonemic awareness. He had no difficulty with phonics. What he did not understand was morphology, and the fact that when we think about the word added, I added 2 and 3 and got 5. He was writing that on a paper for his math. That we have to think about what added means. So can we use that in a sentence? I added, well, when did that happen? Yesterday I added. Well, what if I did it today? Today I will add. Okay, so it's a base element, and we're adding that suffix ed, and it's pronounced id, or depending on how the phonology of what comes right before it. So this kind of concept is something kids need to understand from the very beginning. And as we talked about with this idea of gone and done and been, these words are being taught in kindergarten. Why not just show them the structure? And we don't have to go any deeper than the student wants to go, or that helps that student to understand that particular question at that particular time. But it is something we should be talking about from the very beginning of instruction in the writing system, because it's how it works.
Okay. Since you mentioned those words, done and gone, is NE a suffix?
Actually, that's interesting. That was a question I had for myself, and I talked to Gina about that, and she really knows a lot about Old English. And apparently what I understand, and again, I'm giving you my understanding, early in English's in the history of English, there were many different ways to spell that particular suffix. So we had words like gone and done with an NE. We have words like been with an EN. And then we have words like shown or grown where there was just an N. And as far as I know, it's just in gone and done that NE has persisted. But I may be wrong about that. It'd be an interesting question to look into. But here's one of the things that we'll talk about as we get further along. You don't have to know all the answers to these questions, and I do not know answers to probably half the questions people may ask. But there is a process of investigating the actual writing system and using resources that are out there to find out information that will help us to understand that. And we can verify it with the actual evidence that's in the writing system itself. We'll talk more about that at the end.
Okay, a lot more questions have popped up since we took this little break, but I'm sure that we should probably let you go on, and we'll get to them later.
I don't want to run out of time, and I would be happy to stay a little longer and answer questions if that's helpful. I know people in the past have been frustrated if we go over an hour because they've only allotted an hour, but I will remind people that the recording is always there, and we can sort of officially end at an hour, but I can certainly stay and answer questions a little longer if that's helpful. So, so I'll keep going?
Sure.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about how etymology drives grapheme choice. So we have H-E-A-R and we have H-E-R-E, and they're homophones. Theoretically, you could reverse those spellings, but we've just seen that really wouldn't make sense because of the meaning connections that are embedded in their spelling. We have P-R-E-Y, which is related to predator, so we know why that E is there. We can help kids understand that, and that makes sense. And here's another word that is often misunderstood if we start with pronunciation. M-O-V-E. Move is taught as an exception word by everybody because we don't use the double O to spell oo in this word. We would expect that as in food or tool. Double O is the default spelling for oo, but in this word, as in so many others, the history and the relationships explain the grapheme choice and make it very clear that this is really the only logical way to spell this word. So what you're seeing here is called a lexical word matrix. And this allows us to see an entire family of related words. This shows a set of words, not necessarily an entire set, but a set of words that can be formed from this base element, M-O-V-E. This is a free base. And sometimes we see matrices with bound bases as well, where you have to have a suffix or a prefix added for it to actually be a word that we would recognize in English. But this is a free base. And a word matrix is a linguistic tool, and it has a particular structure. Base elements are in bold, so we see M-O-V-E as a base element. And you can see that from this base, we can also form the word moviegoer using another base that's in there, G-O. So we can form compound words, and in a matrix, what comes before a base is a prefix, what comes after a base is a suffix. So we're looking at the structure of this word, and this all makes sense, but why is it spelled M-O-V-E? Well, this word is derived from a Latin, from a root that was an earlier form of this word. It evolved from this word in Latin, M-O-V-E-R-E. So that gives us our first clue about the reason for the grapheme O in the base. But the other thing that's really interesting is this is actually a twin base. So from this Latin etymon, two different forms of the base emerged in English. One of them is M-O-V-E, and the other one is M-O-T-E. And there are ways that anyone can learn to identify base elements, twin bases from Latin etymons using research tools that are out there. It's so much fun. These two forms, M-O-V-E and M-O-T-E, have the same orthographic denotation. That's what you're seeing in quotes below the spelling of the base element. And in this case, the denotation is move. So that orthographic denotation does not necessarily show up directly in the meaning of every word formed from this base, but there is an echo of that sense that's present in all words in this family. So the sense of move is obviously very clear in words like motion, motility, movement, but it's more of an echo in a word like emotion. But all of these words share a history, they all share meaning, they share structural relationships, and we could go into all kinds of detail on this. It's just amazing. But again, when somebody commented on how nice it is to see that we can use structure with our dyslexic kids, and the way these spellings are constructed is completely logical, completely regular. Kids can learn it, they can apply it consistently, and they see these prefixes and suffixes coming up over and over again. But again, one of the questions that came up was, well, would you do this with a young child? Well, you can go into as much detail as you need with a child given their age. If you're dealing with a very young child, would it help to look at these two words, and only these two words? RE plus MOVE gives us remove. RE plus MOTE gives us remote. Again, remote is not a word that we have as much difficulty with because that O grapheme is pronounced O in remote. Everybody's comfortable with that. It's pronounced differently in remove, but it's spelled the same because of the meaning connection. So kids know what a remote is. They know what a remote control is, the idea of removing. And so just using those two words might be a way to introduce this idea. And I'm just going to contrast this with what we often do. If we try to explain the spelling of move by thinking about pronunciation first, we have to work through all of these options. These are all multiple spellings for oo in English. And it's overwhelming, especially for dyslexic kids. And the truth is these are not all equally possible options. And the one we end up using actually doesn't even appear on the list of multiple spellings for oo. That's why this word is called an exception. But notice there are a number of very common words that use O to spell oo, and there's always a good reason for it. The only way to see a logical reason for the spelling of this word is to connect it to words that share structure and meaning and help kids see that relationship and hold on to that rather than random information that doesn't seem to make sense to them. So we can make sense of irregular words, we can make sense of easily confused words, but we have to do that by studying them in relationship to words that share structure and meaning, because that is how English spelling actually works. So I was hoping to be done at 50 minutes, and I think I'm running a little bit long. I just have a couple more slides to go through, so I think I'm just going to do that, and then we'll definitely take questions at the end. So let's take a look at a couple more words, and we're going to talk about some conventions that affect spelling as well. So here are two words that are often confused. OF is considered irregular because of its pronunciation of. OFF is not, although some people do put it on an irregular word list, and I'm not really sure why, but for sure that might be because they're often mixed up. Kids are always mixing these words up. And we don't really have a good way to explain why they're spelled so similarly, but they mean different things, they're pronounced differently, they just seem kind of random. If you look at it though now, and you're starting to think about structure, these words do seem to be related in structure, but are they related in meaning? Well, this is information from a wonderful resource called Etymonline. You can go to this on the web and look up any word and learn about the history of its evolution into English. And so I looked up the word here, OFF, OFF, and what I see is that it is related to the word OF. So the first line here says by about 1200, OFF was an emphatic form of Old English OF, employed in the adverbial use of that word. I'm not going to go into all the rest of that. There's interesting information there, but I just want you to notice or see that there is a connection in meaning between these words that is much deeper than I ever suspected before I looked this up. And when we see such a connection in meaning, it makes sense that there's a connection in spelling. And it would be really interesting to talk to kids about the meaning connections between these words, between of and off. Once I saw that, I started to think and said, oh, I never really thought about it, but that's kind of interesting. But there's a difference between these two words that actually helps us understand exactly why the first one is spelled OF and the second is OFF. The first word here is a function word, and the second is a lexical or a content word. And there are several conventions in English that relate to these two categories of words. Actually, there are a lot of conventions and a lot of things that we can learn by looking at whether words fall into one category or the other. So let's talk about what lexical and content words and function words are. So a content word would be a noun, a verb, an adjective, or an adverb. And these are typically the dictionary words, the words that we would look up and they would have a meaning all by themselves. We could know what a sweater is or running, or words that really have meaning that exist just in that word in isolation. They carry the meaning in text, typically, and they are typically stressed in connected speech. And that idea of stress is huge in English. That could be another whole conversation. They are also open class. That is, new words are added all the time. Obviously, I updated the slide recently and didn't update my transitions. But lexical words are open class, so we are constantly adding new words. So when we add words like Googling, which is a verb, or I'm going to text someone, or what was the one I wrote down here, an adjective selfie. So a selfie stick, that's a new word that has been added to our lexicon. And those are all going into this bucket called content words or lexical words. Function words, on the other hand, are articles, conjunctions, pronouns, prepositions, auxiliary verbs. They are grammar words. We think of them as sort of the glue that holds sentences together. They do carry some meaning or give us a sense of meaning, but it's not as meaningful as the content words. They are often unstressed in connected speech. Again, huge influence on spelling. And they are closed class. So English has roughly 300 function words, and we really don't add new function words. So we have a number of conventions in English that relate to whether a word is a function word or a content word. And when I first learned this, I just thought, oh, I can't believe nobody ever told me this. So function words can be written with as few letters as phonology allows, often 2 letters. So these words are all function words, and notice they're all 2 letters. And if a word is 2 letters, you can be assured that it is either a function word or it can function as a function word. So we have as, in, on, go, by, and these are all using as few letters, as few graphemes as the phonology requires. So in is if, and we use 2 letters. However, content words have to be at least 3 letters. This is a convention that has a fascinating history, but it's so illuminating to know that, and then look at words like this, because that convention explains the last letter in all of these words. Egg could be spelled with just EG, if all we care about is the phonology, egg. But there is a second G there, and the reason is to satisfy this convention. That is a content word. It has to have at least 3 letters, and so that's why we double the G. And you can see that we do one of 2 things typically. We either double a final consonant, or if we are not, a convention says we don't double that final consonant, like we don't double W's, we don't double Y's, then we add a silent E. We add a final non-syllabic E. We tell kids that final non-syllabic silent E marks a vowel as long, and it does in some words, but there are at least 7, 8, 9 different functions of a silent E, depending on how you categorize things, and this is one of them. It can satisfy this convention of making a content word at least 3 letters. There's one further aspect to this convention that's helpful to know, and that's that when 2 words are homophones, and one is a function word and one is a content word, the content word will be longer whenever possible. So we can look at of and off, and now we know that we've got a function word in of, it's a preposition, off is an adverb, and so now we have a way to explain that. And again, am I going to explain this in great detail to a kindergartner? Maybe not. But it is so helpful when we talk to a kindergartner to be able to say, you know, every word makes sense. There's a reason. And you go into as much or as little as you need to. But as we begin to talk about words in this way, we're also talking about grammar and helping kids learn how the writing system works in more than just spelling. So look at this list of words on the left. They're all function words. We have homophones for those words on the right that are content words. Sometimes we have more than one way to spell a content word using different graphemes. But all of these now make sense in that we see why one group of words is shorter and one group of words is longer. There's so much more we could talk about with function and content words. One of the things Gina said that I loved was she called them the gift that keeps on giving, because we're constantly learning new things about how they affect spelling. If we take a look at the words is and has, and again, very interestingly, when I looked at lists of irregular words, is often on people's irregular word lists, but has isn't, so I don't really understand why that is. But we can make sense of those words, even though we already know that actually the most common way to spell is in English is with an S. But even beyond that, there's a factoid that no English function word contains a Z. How did I get through this much of my life and never know that? I just thought that was amazing. And it explains so many words when we start to think about what function word, the conventions that affect function words and content words and the differences in how those are applied. So I'm going to wrap up. So we've been talking about words that are supposedly irregularly spelled. And that is based on an assumption that the spelling system is supposed to represent pronunciation directly. But the evidence in our writing system is showing us, evidence from lots of words, and I could give you hundreds of words beyond these supposedly irregular words, that is not actually how the writing system works. So does it make sense to declare words irregular, or does it make sense to take a look at the writing system in a different way? If we start looking at English and thinking about it from an orthographic linguistic point of view, and the evidence that we see with our own eyes, we can see that written English is actually an ordered system that is logical and understandable, but it's morphophonemic. The phonology is essential, but you cannot understand phonology unless you look at it within a morphological framework. So, implications for instruction, very briefly. I've been saying it over and over again, but it is so much more powerful to start with the written form. If a student wants to understand a word and they give you a pronunciation, you can say, great, let's look at how that's spelled. You start looking at the spelling, you start understanding it, they understand it, they learn how to spell it, they learn how to read it. We can do systematic, direct, explicit study and instruction using a more accurate understanding of the writing system. And one of the things that's really important in doing that is to study words with meaningful relationships. That expands and deepens our comprehension of words along with spelling. And so again, we start with meaning, morphology, etymology, these all kind of circle around, and then phonology, which continues to circle around. These are all interconnected. And I'll remind you again that in this concept diagram, we see all of those concepts. Now, quickly, I just want to remind you we have these webinars that are already available at IDEA UMB that you can watch. Pete Bowers does a webinar on structured word inquiry, and one of the things that's nice about that webinar is he begins to talk about how people can learn about this through investigating the language themselves with your students on your own. You can start anywhere and use principles of scientific investigation to actually figure out how the writing system works. It's very cool. And of course, Gina's talk that sparked this talk, the insights into sight words, is really worth your time. In the handout, you will get all of these resources. We've got a number of different blogs where teachers are using this kind of understanding in classrooms, some great information on spelling, some websites, and some study and resources. I listed Marcia Henry's book on morphology, even though she does not talk about sight words in this way in her book, but she does talk a lot about morphology, and she has some word matrices and things in that book that really are worth taking a look at if you haven't seen that book as well. So at this point, there's my contact information. You'll have that, and we can talk about some more questions. And I think we're a little bit short of an hour, but we can talk for as long as we need to.
Okay. I did just notice on the previous slide with your resources that there was a blog by a first grade teacher. And I think that is going to be helpful to some of the people that have been listening.
There's a blog by a first grade teacher, and then Lynn Anderson works with actually preschool.
Oh, great.
And she has some wonderful activities that are really appropriate for preschoolers to have them begin to understand some of these concepts. And she's worked, I think, with first graders as well, kindergartners. So yeah, both of those are really good resources.
We do have a number of questions about where would you start, and isn't sound to symbol the primary issue with kids that are severe dyslexics? So I think those blogs would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Here's a question. You're calling these irregular words. Someone is wondering why they're also called red words. Have you run across that?
Yeah, people, those, we call them red words, oddball words, rule breaker words. All of those are just ways of saying these don't fit the rules of the writing system. Sometimes people will have like green words. Those are words that are completely, supposedly regular sound to symbol correspondence. Yellow words, I'm not sure what people do with that. It might be, say there's one grapheme phoneme correspondence that's not totally predictable. And then the red words are the ones where we say, well, those just don't make any sense. We have to completely stop and just learn those in a different way. So I think that's where that concept came from.
Okay. I'm just going to read one more compliment. IDAUMB is a world-class organization. Thank you for bringing such good information on the logical structure of English. Okay. Someone is asking, you mentioned there and where. Why are they pronounced differently? And then what about the word were, W-E-R-E? That's always kind of bunched with those when you're teaching them.
Mm-hmm. So I actually, are you seeing my whole screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see that I just opened up a blank document?
Yes.
Okay. So I can't answer that 100%, but here's what I do know. So the spelling were, here's what I would start to look at. Here's my hypothesis. So the spelling were is W-E-R-E. We could theoretically spell that like this because we use ER to spell often. But we've got an E, and why is that there? Well, I don't know, but I know this word also is spelled R with an E at the end. And these are kind of related in structure and meaning. So I would start by looking at those words. I will tell you, I know you're going to ask me lots of questions that I don't know the answer to, but you can start by saying, I'd like to understand those words, and go to Edum Online, take a look at it, see what you can learn. There also, I should have mentioned that Gina Cook does a lot of online training, and I've taken a lot of that training. It's wonderful. The author of the Real Spelling Resources does wonderful training. And so if you start reading about all the work that's being done in this area, there are many, many ways to start. And I'm betting somebody's probably written about these words. But so, and then was there another question about the pronunciation? Is that?
No. I might have deleted that already.
All right.
Well, because were is different than where and there, the E-R-E.
And we know that we have question words that we often use a WH. I showed you some of those, and so here's where, and we know that we've got what, and all of these are pronounced in my English wha. I don't pronounce them hua, which I think sometimes certain people do pronounce these words that way, but I certainly don't. So if I'm working with a student, I can't help them with that pronunciation by saying what, because as soon as they go to write the word, what day is it, they're not going to pronounce it hua. So that practice of shifting the pronunciation doesn't allow kids to take that out of our classroom and then apply it to their own work. What's much more helpful is to say there's a whole bunch of words that are question words that use WH, and there's again a reason for that. We just touched on that with the information that Gina had shared.
Since you have what up there, I'll ask another question. Do we know why what and that have different pronunciations of the AT?
So the pronunciation is something that I do not understand that well. And here's the thing, it doesn't really matter that much. One of the things that Pete always says that's so interesting is the good news is kids already know how to pronounce it. So it's not like we have to teach them how to pronounce what. I mean, they know. What they don't know is how to spell it. And so if I can connect the spelling to something that has meaning, I don't always understand the pronunciation shifts. I know there's been, if you look into the history of English, there was this thing called the Great Vowel Shift, where we began the pronunciation of words shifted to a different place in the mouth, and vowels are now pronounced differently than they were hundreds of years ago. I would love to learn more about that, but I don't even need to know that to help a student understand and see a relationship between what and that, and get that spelling anchored in their understanding of the word.
Mm-hmm. This is my question. I'm just curious. Has there ever been a time in the history of American education where morphology and etymology were emphasized more?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. I think that there has been emphasis on morphology. If you go back and read the Bible of Orton Gillingham, the Gillingham Manual, in there Anna Gillingham talks about Latin base elements. She talks about understanding those structures. And I think that what happened is when people stopped studying Latin, when they stopped studying Greek, maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago, a lot of that understanding became sort of pushed aside because it was thought that people didn't have the background to understand it. But I will say that I have never studied Latin as a language, but I am now taking classes with this real spelling author who's brilliant, and learning about how you can understand Latin etymons and how they have evolved into English without necessarily learning everything you need to know to actually be able to be fluent in Latin, if there was such a thing. So I think that we've lost that over the years, and people are starting to talk about morphology, and that's good. But if we continue to keep morphology as something that doesn't get addressed till you're in 5th grade, 6th grade, and it's sort of an advanced skill, we're kind of missing this idea that it really is so foundational we should start talking about it on day one.
Okay. There are some questions that were up early, 7:15, 7:20, that are asking about why not start with phonology, which a lot of words are phonetic, but I think you've referred to that, and also they can look at these blogs. The last question that was just added, maybe we could close with this. How can this help kids that are English language learners?
Okay, I want to actually touch on what you talked about first, because I want to make sure I'm clear on this whole phonology thing, because one of the things that people sometimes start to be concerned about when they see this is that we're going to lose that ability to help kids understand phonology. Dyslexic kids, we know, have difficulty with phonemic awareness. They have difficulty with rapid naming. They have trouble accessing the pronunciations of the graphemes that they're looking at. And we actually have to help them with that. That is not something that we in any way should ignore. But we can study that more accurately by starting with the written form and then talking grapheme to phoneme, and then helping them understand that before we can figure out which grapheme is going to be assigned to a particular. Let me just give you a quick example. So this word nation. If we want kids to be able to spell this, they cannot spell that unless they start thinking about morphology. If you just spell it from phonology, maybe that, nation, because there's that sh in there. And kids need to know there's a sh. And we will teach them that it's a T, but you how are they going to remember how to spell it? Well, you have to connect it to something that has meaning. There's a base element that means to come into being or be born, N-A-T-E. It's in nation. Whoops. So if they see, I always talk, whenever I'm talking to kids about this word family, I always use the word innate, because again, the phonology of N-A-T-E in innate is very clear. It's very easy for kids to remember and think about. And now they have something to hang that phonology on and the orthography on that is meaningful, that's connected. It helps them understand. And we talk about the fact that a T can be pronounced sh in English. It often is. And that when it's followed by an I, that's something that we may see. So I don't want to in any way say that we aren't going to help kids understand that, and they have to learn that if you have this word bent, it's bent, you know, we're going to blend it together. How much we do that is going to be dependent on the kid, but it's going to be in context of something that makes more sense. So that's, and just want to make sure I address that. And then what was the last question?
There was a question about how this could help English language learners, and then someone also made a comment that actually this is how English language learners are taught. They're taught by linguists.
Great. Then I will leave that as the answer, because, you know, it's, again, one of the things Gina, I love quoting Gina, but one of the things she says is the writing system works the way it works no matter who you are. So if you're dyslexic, if you're an English language learner, if you're a person who is studying for the ACTs and wants to understand vocabulary in a more meaningful and deep way, understanding how the writing system works is appropriate. How we then teach that is something that we can continue talking about. But the foundational information, the place to start is to actually show kids how the writing system is actually organized and how it works. So, thank you.
I think that's about it.
Great. Well,